The night air clung heavy to my skin as I walked past glittering windows filled with laughter and warmth I could no longer claim. My reflection in the glass startled me. Messy hair, hollow eyes, a woman far older than her 31 years. I used to glide through doors like these without a second thought, my heels echoing confidence across marble floors. Now I hovered on the outside, invisible discarded carrying wounds that time refused to stitch shut. My name is Clara, and this is the story of how betrayal doesn't just break your heart, it rewires your soul. It changes the way you breathe, the way you look at strangers, the way you dare, or refuse to hope again. I was once a daughter of privilege, raised in a family where power meant protection. But the very people I trusted most, the ones I believed would fight for me, were the ones who lit the match and watched me burn. It began the year after my father died. His death was sudden, but the unraveling of our family was slower, quieter, like rot in the beams of a house no one bothered to repair. I was 26, then still naive enough to believe blood was thicker than water. My uncle Arthur stepped in to manage our estate. My cousins pretended to console me, but their eyes glittered with something I didn't recognize at the time: ambition. I signed papers I didn't understand, trusting them because they carried our name. And within months, everything that was once mine was gone. The company, the house, even my father's watch. I wasn't just betrayed, I was erased. At first, I fought. I screamed, I demanded explanations, I tried to prove the documents were forged. But every lawyer I hired suddenly dropped my case. Every door I knocked on closed in my face. It was as if the world had decided my voice no longer mattered. And when I confronted my uncle directly, his words cut me deeper than any blade. "You were never strong enough for this. Consider it a mercy that we took the burden from you." Mercy. That was the word he used as he ripped apart the last fragments of my father's legacy. I wandered for years after that, stripped of pride, stripped of identity, carrying only memories that grew heavier with each mile. Nights in cheap hostels, days filled with meaningless jobs that never lasted. I learned to make myself small, to apologize for breathing. And yet inside me, something hard and sharp began to grow. It wasn't until last winter that fate brought me back to the city I swore I'd never return to. I was standing outside a restaurant, shivering in a coat too thin for the snow. When I saw them, Arthur, my cousins, their spouses, seated inside, toasting glasses of wine beneath golden chandeliers. They looked untouched, unscarred, their lives fattened on the bones of mine. My stomach twisted with hunger, but it was the hunger for justice, not food, that burned hottest. I thought I would collapse right there on the icy sidewalk. But instead, a stranger's voice pulled me back. "Are you all right?" I turned, and for the first time in years, someone looked at me without dismissal. He was older than me by a few years, dressed in a tailored coat, his expression one of genuine concern. His name was Daniel, though I didn't know it then. All I knew was that his eyes saw through the dirt and weariness clinging to me. I wanted to push him away. I wanted to say, "Leave me in peace. I don't need saving." But the truth, I did need saving. Maybe not from the cold or the hunger, but from the loneliness that had become my second skin. Daniel didn't know my past, not yet. But as he handed me a cup of coffee and asked me to sit with him, I felt the first crack in the walls I had built. He spoke with ease, as though I wasn't a stranger on the street, as though I mattered. And though part of me wanted to run, another part whispered, "Stay. For once, stay." That night after we parted, I lay awake in a borrowed bed, staring at the ceiling. Memories of my uncle's words, my cousin's laughter, my mother's silence, all of it pressed against me like a weight I couldn't escape. But now there was a flicker of something else. Not hope, not yet, but the possibility of it. And with that flicker came a terrifying thought. Maybe I wasn't done. Maybe the story I thought had ended with betrayal was only waiting for me to find the strength to turn the page. I told myself not to see him again. I told myself that kindness is a baited hook, and I had already swallowed too many. But the next afternoon, as the wind scraped down the avenue, I found my feet drifting back to the same coffee shop, as if my body remembered safety before my mind would admit it. He was there reading something with margins full of notes, the kind of man who underlines verbs as if motion matters more than nouns. He looked up surprised, then genuinely glad, and the familiarity of that expression almost undid me. I sat hands wrapped around the paper cup he offered, letting warmth migrate into the bones that had learned winter too well. I didn't mean to tell him anything. I had rehearsed silence. And yet the story dragged itself out of me like a splinter piece by bleeding piece. My father's sudden death, my uncle's careful smile, the papers I signed under grief-thick eyes, the doors that closed in, orchestrated sequence. As I spoke, shame tried to lace my sentences with apology, but Daniel would not let it. He listened the way doctors listen before they touch a wound, not flinching, not judging, only making space for the truth to breathe. He told me he consulted for nonprofits, messy budgets, broken boards, families that turned organizations into fiefdoms. He said, "Betrayal has a shape if you look long enough. It almost always leaves an arithmetic behind. If things were taken from you," he said carefully, "they left a trail to each other." He slid a napkin between us and sketched a crooked tree, a trunk labeled estate branches marked shell companies, trusts, consulting fees, campaign donations. It seemed absurd to learn the language of my own undoing at a small table with the smell of sugar in the air, but as his pen moved, something hardened in me. It wasn't hope, it was permission. Permission to stop thinking of myself as discarded and start thinking as a witness. That evening I went back to the neighborhood I had avoided for years. The old house had been sold, its windows trimmed with new, indifferent light. I stood across the street and watched strangers move inside rooms that had once held our summers, our arguments, my mother's piano. Loss has a sound. It is the note that never quite resolves. I turned away and found myself in front of the church where we used to attend funerals and fundraisers. I slipped inside and sat in the last pew. The floorboards remembered my weight. A janitor I vaguely recognized shuffled down the aisle and stopped beside me with a gentle, questioning look. I said my name. He frowned, then softened in a way that terrified me with its kindness. "Your father left envelopes here," he murmured, eyes lowering as if the rafters were listening. "He used to say the church is the only vault God bothers to watch." He led me to the sacristy and opened a drawer that stuck like an old throat. From the back, wrapped in a plastic sleeve, he pulled a thin packet and held it out as though it could explode. In a supply closet with a failing light, I opened my father's handwriting. There were copies of contracts I had never seen, consulting agreements paying my uncle for strategic oversight, invoices from shell companies for advisory services, a wire transfer list that zigzagged through banks with cheerful names. At the bottom, a letter to me in case the rot persists. He had suspected them. He apologized for leaving me alone with wolves, and then scrawled sideways across the last page a sentence that dropped the floor out from under me. "Your mother knew." I thought the bulb would burn out with the speed of my breathing. In that moment, the betrayal rearranged itself again, not a single blade, but a roomful of them. I pressed my palms to the page as if I could push the words back into the paper and change them. But the ink had dried a long time ago. I brought the packet to Daniel because my hands wouldn't stop shaking and because some part of me already trusted the way his mind made maps. He laid everything flat, careful, reverent, and read like a person who believed a life might depend on not missing a comma. He didn't look at me when he said quietly, "Clara, this is a spine." He pointed to a string of payments that circled through a nonprofit our family had funded in my father's name, money that should have carried his memory into scholarships and clinics, and instead vanished into management fees signed by Arthur and initialed by my mother. The signatures were too neat. Mine had always looped nervously, theirs didn't wobble at all. "If we can corroborate this with bank statements," he said, "you have something that breathes in court." It was nearly midnight when I called my mother. I hadn't said her name aloud in months, and hearing her voice scraped me raw. I wanted to rage. What came out was a single question that tasted like a child: why? She didn't hang up. She said my father had made promises he couldn't keep, that the company was a patient on too many machines, that Arthur stabilized what he could. She asked me if I had eaten, as if her concern could wash the ledger clean. I told her about the envelopes in the church, about the payments that braided their way through our grief, about the letter that said her hands were not clean. Silence thickened on the line until I could hear the soft click of her swallow. When she finally spoke, her words were steady and ruinous. She had signed to protect what remained: her house, her status, the version of our name that bought dinner reservations. "I thought you would understand when you were older," she said. I looked at my knuckles white around the phone and remembered the piano keys she'd stopped touching after my father's funeral. Maybe guilt can paralyze an instrument. Maybe it can tune it to a frequency only dogs hear. I didn't sleep. The next day, I asked Daniel to teach me how to read public filings, to follow addresses until they turned into walls with mail slots to match dates, like a detective trading sleep for certainty. He spread documents across his kitchen table and turned the room into a war room where the enemy was paper and the weapon was patience. I learned the smell of toner and fear. I learned how money hides in plain sight. And I learned with a clarity that scared me that revenge is not a scream but a sequence. When we found the transfer that proved the trust I had signed away, fed directly into my uncle's campaign fund under the name of a consulting LLC, I laughed in a way that made Daniel look at me with worry. It was not joy. It was the sound of a chain snapping. I could see the scene before it happened, my uncle's gracious smile faltering in front of cameras, my cousins' faces trying on shock for a size that wouldn't fit, my mother folding into a chair when a reporter said my name. It wasn't mercy I wanted anymore. It was balance. I went back to the church with a second envelope, my own, and left it in the drawer where my father had trusted God to keep watch. Inside, I wrote everything I planned to do, not because I needed God to witness it, but because I needed the room to remember the day I stopped being erased. I woke with the taste of iron in my mouth, as if my dreams had been chewing through chains all night. The city looked different that morning, colder, sharper, like a chessboard waiting for me to place my first piece. Daniel and I sat at his table surrounded by papers and half-drunk coffee, and I told him I was ready. Ready to stop mourning and start moving. He studied me with those steady eyes that saw through both my bravado and my fear, then nodded as if he had been waiting for that sentence all along. We began quietly. Requests for bank statements filed under rights. I didn't know I still had inquiries that rattled doors I thought had been locked forever. Each document that arrived was another tile in a mosaic of theft, my uncle's neat signature dancing on checks that funneled my father's legacy into his campaigns and vacations. It was grotesque, obscene, almost laughable in its brazenness. I kept hearing his voice: "You were never strong enough for this." And each new page of evidence felt like a rebuttal, a whispered "watch me." But the deeper I dug, the more the wounds reopened. Seeing my mother's name beside Arthur's on authorizations broke me in ways even hunger hadn't. She had always been elegant, aloof, a woman who prided herself on restraint. I had spent years excusing her distance as grief. Now I saw it for what it was: complicity. When I confronted her again, her voice was calm, almost resigned. "Clara, I protected what I could. If you had been older, wiser, you would have seen it too. Older, wiser." The words seared as if survival had been a failure of youth instead of a theft by family. Daniel told me not to let her rewrite the narrative. "Guilt wears many disguises," he said. "Don't mistake her justifications for truth." But late at night, lying on the thin mattress in my borrowed room, I wrestled with both rage and longing. She was still my mother. Some part of me still wanted her arms, even as I prepared to put her in front of the fire with the rest. Betrayal is cruel like that. It keeps you tethered to the very hands that cut you. The first real blow came when Daniel arranged a meeting with a journalist he trusted. Her name was Elise, and she carried herself with the weariness of someone who had seen too many truths buried by power. She spread our documents across her desk, scanning, circling, asking questions so precise they made my stomach twist. When she looked up, her eyes gleamed not with pity, but with recognition. "This isn't just a family squabble," she said. This is fraud. Election law violations. If this goes public, it won't just stain them, it'll consume them. Her words sent a shiver down my spine. For years, I had imagined revenge as a private act, a confrontation, a scream, a reclaiming of dignity. But this was bigger. This was erasure of their masks. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt the weight of fire in my hands, and fire doesn't ask who it burns. The weeks that followed were a blur of preparation. Elise built timelines, Daniel mapped connections, and I rehearsed my own story until it no longer trembled in my throat. But as the walls closed in around Arthur and my cousins, something unexpected happened. Invitations started arriving at Daniel's office. Galas, fundraisers, charity events, my family reaching out not to me directly, but to the man they suspected was stirring ghosts. They wanted to measure him, intimidate him, perhaps lure me out. Each envelope was perfume and poison. Then came the wedding invitation. Not for me, of course, but for Daniel. My cousin Lydia Goldenchild, Arthur's jewel, was marrying a financier whose name I recognized from the shell companies. A perfect union of greed disguised as love. When Daniel showed me the card, my pulse roared in my ears. It was the same hall where I had once danced as a girl, where my father had toasted futures that never came. I thought my knees would buckle, but then slowly I felt something else rise resolve. "I'll go," I whispered. "Not as myself, not yet, but I need to see them. I need them to see me." Daniel hesitated. "It's dangerous, they'll smell blood." "Then let them," I said, surprising even myself. "I've lived as prey long enough." The night of the wedding was a fever dream. Chandeliers dripped with light, violins hummed, and every corner reeked of power pretending to be joy. I entered on Daniel's arm, my borrowed gown hugging a body that had once known these fabrics. Heads turned, whispers bloomed. I could see my cousins' faces freeze, their smiles falter before they tightened again, like masks reheated. And then I saw my mother, elegant as ever, lifting her glass to toast. Her eyes found mine across the room, and in that split second, her hand trembled. It was the first crack I had ever seen in her. The ceremony blurred, but the reception was sharp. Lydia floated in her dress like a swan. Arthur played patriarch with oily charm, and everywhere I turned, eyes tracked me. When I approached the table, silence fell like a curtain. "Congratulations," I said evenly, my voice carrying farther than I intended. Lydia's lips parted. Arthur's jaw tightened. My mother looked away. For once, I wasn't the ghost in the room, I was the haunting. Later, as I stood alone near the grand staircase, Arthur came to me. His smile was polished, but his eyes burned. "Enjoying yourself, Clara," he murmured. I leaned closer enough for him to smell the steel in my breath. "Immensely. I've been waiting for this stage all my life." He stiffened the mask, slipping for just a heartbeat, and in that heartbeat I knew he was afraid. I didn't sleep the night after the wedding. The chandeliers, the whispers, the sight of my mother's hand trembling, they played over in my mind like a reel on repeat. For years I had imagined being invisible in that world, erased like chalk in the rain. But that night, standing in the hall where they toasted their stolen victories, I realized something profound. I was no longer the one who had to hide. They were. Arthur's eyes had betrayed it. Behind the practiced smirk and silvered hair, I saw fear coil around his confidence. He knew I hadn't come back to smile politely and disappear. He knew ghosts don't return without reason. The next morning, I met Daniel and Elise in her office, the walls plastered with documents and photographs that stitched together the anatomy of betrayal. Elise slid an envelope across the desk. "Anonymous source," she said, though we all knew my mother's handwriting when we saw it. Inside was a check register, her initials next to Arthur's, on transfers that fed their empire of fraud. My chest constricted. Even after hearing her admit it over the phone, seeing the evidence inked in her script was a wound all over again. Daniel placed his hand gently over mine. "This is the thread that unravels everything. They'll try to bury it, but if we act quickly," Elise interrupted, her voice sharp. "This isn't just about them anymore. If this breaks, politicians, donors, even banks will be dragged into the fallout. They'll fight like cornered animals." For a moment, the weight of it nearly crushed me. Revenge had been a private hunger, a fire in my gut. But this was a wildfire that would scorch more than just the guilty. Could I carry that? Could I live with the collateral ash? That night I walked alone through the streets, the city humming with indifference. I thought about my father, how he used to rest his hand on my shoulder and tell me our name meant something. I thought about the letter he left in the church, the words scrawled in desperation. Your mother knew. And I thought about myself, the woman who had survived hunger, humiliation, exile. Was I strong enough to not only expose them but also to live with what came after? The answer came the next morning when I woke to find a note slipped under my door. 4 words scrawled in hurried ink: stay quiet or suffer. My hands shook as I read it, but instead of fear, what surged through me was fury. They still thought I could be silenced. They still thought I was the girl who signed papers blindly, who crumbled under their definitions of mercy. They didn't understand the woman I had become. I handed the note to Elise and she nodded grimly. Then we move now. The article broke 3 days later. Elise's words were sharp, relentless, woven with documents that painted a story too damning to ignore. Arthur's face graced the front page, his smile frozen in a photograph from the wedding, beneath a headline that spoke of fraud, embezzlement, betrayal. My cousins were named. My mother's signature appeared in black and white. The city erupted. News vans parked outside their homes, microphones thrust at gates that had always kept questions out. Allies distanced themselves. Invitations to galas evaporated overnight. And for the first time in years, I felt the scales tilt. But victory was not clean. My mother called me, her voice frayed with desperation. Clara, how could you? Do you know what you've done to us? To us, I whispered, or to you. Her silence was more painful than her anger, because beneath it, I still heard the woman who had once sung me lullabies, and I hated that I missed her even now. Arthur tried to contact me too, through lawyers, through intermediaries, through threats. But I ignored them all. When power loses its grip, it thrashes, but thrashing is not winning. Weeks later, I returned to the church. The pews smelled of wax and dust, the air still heavy with the memory of my father's faith. I placed a fresh envelope in the drawer this time, filled not with evidence, but with reflection. A letter to myself, to the girl I used to be. You were strong enough. You always were. They only convinced you otherwise. As I left, I saw Daniel waiting outside, leaning against the iron fence. He didn't say anything, just opened his arms, and for the first time I let myself lean. Revenge had been the fire that carried me back, but it was something quieter, something like love that promised a life beyond ashes. I still carry scars. I still wake some nights hearing my uncle's voice or seeing my mother's trembling hand. Betrayal doesn't vanish when justice arrives, but it transforms. It becomes a story you own instead of one that owns you. And if you've listened this far, if you've felt pieces of your own pain in my words, I hope you hear this. Betrayal is not the end. Sometimes it is the door you walk through to find yourself again. So if my story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment. I want to hear your stories too, your battles, your victories, your wounds. Because healing isn't just about reclaiming what was stolen, it's about knowing you were never broken to begin with.